Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jack Douglas. An Irish poet who once visited America said, "My heart is pure this happy day, for I have stood where brave men stood, and I have stood where brave men fought, and I have stood where brave men died." Ladies and gentlemen, during the next 30 minutes, you and I will have the chance to see many of the historic and sacred places where brave men stood and fought and died on American soil. This special America program could have only one title: Fields of Glory. This is Concord, Massachusetts, and once upon a time, roughly 100 years ago, this tiny community was the literary center of America. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sage of Concord, conceived many of his noted essays in this very house, and this was the home of the Alcott family. Yes, Louisa May Alcott, who gave the world Little Women. This giant of literature was also attracted by Concord, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and here he brought his newlywed wife, and here he wrote Mosses from an Old Manse. By the banks of Walden Pond, the rebel of Concord letters, Henry David Thoreau, built a cabin and shut himself off from the world for 2 years, and then rewarded the world with Walden, a rhapsodic diary of a love affair with nature. But even before Thoreau and the others were born, an event took place here in Concord that was destined to change the course of human history. This small obelisk marks the very spot, and as we approach it, the weather-beaten plaque describes a momentous incident. Here on the 19th of April, 1775, was made the first forcible resistance to British aggression. On the opposite bank stood the American militia. Here stood the invading army, and on this spot, the first of the enemy fell in the war of that revolution which gave independence to these United States. The opposite bank of the lazy, lovely Concord River, the bank occupied by the Minutemen, was spanned, then as now, by a small wooden bridge. Once across the bridge, you will be standing on sacred American soil, a small plot of ground dominated by the famous statue of the Minuteman. The words are by Emerson. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Only a few feet away is the final resting place of 3 British redcoats killed in the skirmish, and James Russell Lowell wrote their epitaph, "They came 3,000 miles and died to keep the past upon its throne." At sundown, there were few in Concord who slept soundly. This was open rebellion. But from the hills of Virginia, the voice that had cried out in anger for 10 years cried out again, and now electrified the colonies. Gentlemen may cry, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. And then in 7 concluding words, Patrick Henry gave the world an everlasting standard by which to measure freedom. Give me liberty or give me death. The 13 colonies were willing to pay the price. A year was to pass before the Declaration of Independence was signed, a declaration of human rights from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. This was a day to remember, and so was Christmas night 1776, when Washington crossed the Delaware and captured Trenton in a surprise attack. But a year later came the winter of 1777-78, the winter America was never to forget. It happened here in a hamlet some 20 miles from Philadelphia, and seeing it like this in the bright sunshine of summer, it's hard to associate this pleasant surrounding with the unbearable suffering and human misery experienced by 11,000 troops under Washington's command. But the punishment they endured, cold, sick, literally starving to death, gave military historians a new synonym for grit and guts: Valley Forge. In meantime, by the middle of January, wooden huts such as these had been built to house the cold and tattered troops. Then the turning point, February 23, 1778. At Valley Forge on that day, the Prussian military hero, Baron Frederick von Steuben, freshly arrived from Europe, offered his services, which Washington gratefully accepted. With the rank of Major General, the Prussian drill master welded an army of brave misfits into an army of disciplined soldiers. The 13 colonies could now say, "We have an army." Indeed, the arrival of von Steuben at Valley Forge is accepted as the unofficial birthday of the American Army. And today, when you visit Valley Forge State Park, you will find much that is worth seeing. In this house, Washington made his headquarters, and here Martha Washington came in that bitter February to join the wives of other officers and soldiers, cooking, knitting, nursing the sick and the dying. Of those who perished during this winter of nightmares, only the grave of Lieutenant John Waterman of Rhode Island was marked. And of America's many fields of glory, Valley Forge is singular in this respect. No major battle or skirmish was fought here, yet 3,000 men died on this plain. Their only enemies had been the hard, bitter hand of nature and the lack of supplies. And Washington, the professional soldier, knew raw courage when he saw it, and so atop this handsome memorial arch has been inscribed just a portion of the general's lavish praise of his men. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. In the warmer climate of the Virginia countryside, 3.5 long years after Valley Forge, the Grand Union of England would fly for the last time as the sovereign flag of the colonies. But here at Yorktown, the fleur-de-lis of France had every reason to wave proudly in the soft breeze. For while we remember the great Lafayette, and well we should, it was the French army under Count de Rochambeau joining forces with Washington's troops that pounded Cornwallis into submission. For more than a week, Cornwallis was to prove a formidable antagonist. But outnumbered 2-to-1 and cut off from retreat by the sea because of storms and a French fleet, Cornwallis sent out his flag of truce on October 17, 1781, and 2 days later, the surrender was signed in this very house. England had lost what was destined to become the richest jewel her empire would ever possess. In the southern part of Texas, the city of San Antonio in 1837 was the center of the Texas struggle for independence from Mexico. On February 23, the Mexican dictator general Santa Anna invaded the city with an army of about 1,000 men, a number that increased to 4,000 or more within a matter of days. This was to be the battleground, the field of glory, the mission chapel known as the Alamo, converted into a fort by 187 volunteers to the cause of Texas independence. These volunteers from many states and even foreign countries, including Mexico, were under the joint command of Lieutenant Colonel William Travis of the Texas Army and the knife fighter from Kentucky and Louisiana, Jim Bowie. Refusing to surrender, Travis and his men withstood the siege for 13 days. And then on the 13th day, Santa Anna's forced prisoner was taken. Every man in the Alamo had died fighting. Travis, Bowie, Bonham, all dead. And this man, a hero in life, also died as a hero is expected to die. Here was no starry-eyed Wild West cowboy, but a real frontiersman, a Tennessee legislator, a 3-time congressman. Yes, Davy Crockett was also at the Alamo. Some Alamo visitors say, but there isn't very much to see here. Well, that's true. There aren't even any grave markers, for the bodies of the Texans were burned by order of Santa Anna. But when you come here to the Alamo, you will be affected not merely by what you see, but by what you feel. 46 days after the Alamo fell, General Sam Houston demolished Santa Anna's forces. The Lone Star Republic was now in the making, and in that distant Valhalla reserved for a very special breed of men, 187 heroes could now rest in peace. Nature, like some forms of animal life, has the capacity to lick its wounds, and the wounds heal, and the loveliness that was is born again. And as we walk along this quiet stream and its wooded glens, we cannot possibly imagine just how well nature has concealed its man-made scars, not unless we go back 100 years. Yes, this is Manassas, better known as Bull Run, the name of that nearby stream. It is the War of the Brothers, the war between the states, and here at Bull Run was fought the first field battle of the war, some 24 days after the firing on Fort Sumter. Many of the war's greatest generals from both sides saw action here, and at one point in the fierce fighting, a Confederate officer shouted to his men, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally round the Virginians." The nickname stuck, and one of the ablest generals in military history would forever be known as Stonewall Jackson. This Jackson, this Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, was no plantation powder puff, but a professional, a graduate of West Point, a professor of the military arts, and in the field, a brilliant tactician and leader of men. This first battle of Bull Run turned into a rout of the Union forces, and more than a year later, the blue and the gray met again at Bull Run, and again the Confederates, thanks largely to Jackson, were the victors. When the two battles of Bull Run had ended, Manassas looked like this. In terms of human casualties, the Federal losses amounted to 17,000, while the Confederate loss approximated 11,000. Stone House, near the site of the first battle, was used as a hospital by both sides. This reconstruction is almost too attractive, but then man, like nature and its creatures, also tries to hide his scars. Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, just north of the Maryland border, is a college town, a nice town, a quiet town. But for 3 days, July 1 to July 3 in 1863, the fields and ridges of Gettysburg were the scene of the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. 97,000 Union troops commanded by General Meade were engaged in a gigantic struggle by 75,000 Confederates under the revered Robert E. Lee. The losses stagger the imagination. 51,000 dead and wounded from the combined armies of 172,000. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought but once. It has been refought and re-examined, however, at least 1 million times by war colleges and military institutions throughout the world. A complete tour of the Gettysburg National Military Park would take days, if not weeks. In size, it approximates 3,000 acres, and all told, there are more than 1,400 monuments, tablets, and markers, each worthy of more than passing consideration. This unusual memorial, the High Water Mark Monument, commemorates the spot where Pickett's famous charge was finally stopped by the Union brigades. As events later proved, this was literally the high water mark of the Confederate cause. If the charge had succeeded, if Gettysburg had been won by the noble Lee, well, we will never know. We do know that the tide of the Confederacy had swept to its crest, paused, and receded. The war would continue, but from this point on, all roads would lead to Appomattox Courthouse. The magnificent Stonewall Jackson was not at Gettysburg. only 60 days earlier, he had mistakenly been shot and mortally wounded at twilight by his own men. A few months after the battle, in November, it was decided that Gettysburg Field should be dedicated as a cemetery. Edward Everett, the outstanding orator of his time, was the guest of honor. His speech lasted for 2 solid hours. Also invited, almost as an afterthought, was a man whose presence actually embarrassed the committee. Not one American in 10,000 knows what Mr. Everett said, but few in the civilized world have not memorized at least a portion of the handwritten, softly spoken text that begins, 87 years ago. The cannons are still now, the words of Lincoln go marching on, and this field of glory will outlast the lifespan of generations yet unborn. How briskly these 2 young men approached this old house, but on Palm Sunday in 1865, 2 older men, 2 tired men, 2 tormented men were not so anxious to mount the steps of McLean House in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. They sat in this parlor and they talked. They talked not of this war, but of the Mexican War and the old Army days, and finally, to the business at hand, surrender. Robert E. Lee, the heart, the soul, the pride of the Confederacy. Ulysses S. Grant, the cigar-chomping, whiskey-drinking military genius who was now the hero of the North. Grant's terms of surrender were so generous that Lee could not help expressing his appreciation. A stroke of the pen and a nation was reunited and a nation rejoiced. The jubilation was not to last a week. On April 14, only 5 days after Appomattox, President Lincoln was fatally wounded by John Wilkes Booth. The year is 1868. The Sioux and Cheyenne sign a treaty with the United States. A vast area, including the Black Hills, is to be set aside as a permanent home for the 2 Indian nations. But less than 10 years later, greedy gold prospectors violate the treaty repeatedly. The Indians take to the warpath. From Washington in February of 1876 came a strong directive: commence operations against the hostile Indians. No one could foretell that this would be the field of glory, the banks and ridges of what was then a relatively unknown river, the Little Bighorn in Montana. George A. Custer had been a general in the Union Army at the age of 23. After the war and at Little Bighorn, he was attached to the 7th Cavalry with the rank of lieutenant colonel. The 7th Cavalry was only one of numerous infantry and cavalry units involved in the overall operations under Generals Crook, Terry, and Gibbon, but the 7th was Custer's command. A long chain of complicated circumstances prompted Custer to split his forces, so that on June 25, the day of the battle, Custer engaged the Indians with only about 225 men under his immediate command. Surprised by the size of the enemy force, outnumbered by perhaps 10 to 1 or more, the outcome was massacre. What really happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn is almost as much a mystery today as it was then, for not a single man with Custer survived the slaughter. Indeed, apart from the enemy, the only living thing to emerge from the battle was Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche. And so for most of what we know, we have had to rely on meager, vague information from Indians who participated in the battle. We know that many famous chiefs were gathered in the huge Indian encampment, but which one was the dominant figure? Was it Gall, or the Sioux medicine man Sitting Bull, or was the real leader the fearless Crazy Horse? We do not know. We know that Custer had trusted and capable Indian scouts, yet Custer apparently was ignorant of the strength of the main Indian encampment. Why? We do not know. Did the battle last a full 2 days, as some believe, or was it over in a matter of hours or even minutes? We do not know. But we do know this. We know that once inside these gates, we will be standing in the spiritual presence of 225 men who died with their boots on. Now, theirs was not a sacrifice of life in exchange for liberty or for religious freedom, yet the lack of lofty motives does not diminish their glory. These men were professional soldiers, and they died like professional soldiers. Why else would a mere handful of men be so well remembered in the pages of history? They come to this building, and they come by the thousands daily. They come to honor a great soldier who closed his military career with these words.
But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
Yes, those were the words of General of the Armies, Douglas MacArthur. He is buried here in the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, and a few feet away from his tomb is this reminder of his greatest triumph, part of the platform or decking from the USS Missouri on which the general stood in accepting the formal Japanese instrument of surrender at the close of World War II. The general was right. Old soldiers never die, but the general was wrong. They do not simply fade away. They live forever in the hearts of their people. They are remembered at their fields of glory. Their deeds are recorded in the pages of history. Their memories are cherished by the flower of their nation's youth who would follow in their footsteps. Ladies and gentlemen, the painting Custer's Last Stand by Edgar S. Paxson is on exhibit at the Whitney Gallery in Cody, Wyoming. Washington at Valley Forge was reproduced by permission of the Valley Forge Historical Society. And our very special thanks to the Cadet Corps of VMI, the Virginia Military Institute. Thank you and good night.